God moves. I'll explain why. Exodus is the story of God working through a man named Moses to rescue the Israelites, his chosen people, out of bondage and slavery in Egypt into the wilderness where they would wander for a number of years, heading toward a promised land that God had promised to their ancestors, a good land, a land of their own, a land flowing with milk and honey. Now, the book of Exodus is really important to us. I mean, these are some of our foundational stories in Christianity. I mean, this is our spiritual heritage, so it's important we know and understand these stories. But more importantly, it's important that we see how God moved in these stories. Because the God that we will read about in Exodus is the same God we worship today. The God who moved then moves now. The God who worked in the lives of his people then works in the lives of his people now. And so my hope is that through these stories, we're not going to just know old stories. We're not going to just know Bible better, but we're going to know the God of the Bible better and who he can be in our lives and wants to be in our lives and is in our lives. And I want to make one point really, really clear. We're going to be reading stories about people. Moses, Aaron, Pharaoh, the Israelites, and many others. And that's true when you read the Bible. It's stories about people. But really, these are stories about God. When you read the Bible, God is the main actor. He's the leading role. And the stories are simply the people that God works for and through. And so we're not going to have a sermon series on how Moses moved or how Aaron moved or how the Israelites moved. These are stories about how God moved and moves today. Today we're going to talk about ways that God frequently, in fact I would say most often, moves behind the scenes. How God works backstage, how God is often working out of sight. When I was in high school, I got the opportunity to be in a parade at Walt Disney World, and that was kind of a neat thing. I'd grown up in Orlando. I'd been to Disney countless times. In fact, I remember being at Disney the very first week they opened. So I knew Disney really well, and I'd seen the parade, and I got to be in the parade. But to be in the parade meant that you had to go backstage. And backstage at Disney doesn't look anything like Main Street or Fantasyland or any of the other places. Backstage, it's a little more industrial. There's trucks delivering food. There's people working back there that aren't dressed up as characters. There's trash trucks back there hauling away all of the garbage we create in a day at Disney. You get to see that there's a lot of things that have to happen behind the scenes to make Disney work. The biggest surprise I had that day was when I saw Mickey without his head on. But that wasn't what was surprising. What was surprising was that Mickey wasn't a he, it was a her. It was a very tiny little Asian woman. That just kind of surprised me. I went back to Disney many times, but as an adult. But in adult eyes, I started noticing, maybe you've noticed this, everything's always perfect at Disney. Everything is always perfect. The landscape is always manicured. There's never a light bulb out at Disney. There's never places that are out of order or paint that's starting to look a little faded. And I found out later it's because when we go home at night, another crew arrives every night, working throughout the night to make sure Disney looks new and fresh and perfect when we arrive as guests the next day. You see, the magic we experience at Disney requires a lot of work behind the scenes. For Disney to be a great experience, a lot has to happen that you and I aren't even aware of, that we don't even know has happened, right? And so that's kind of what I want to talk about today, is the way that God moves in our lives in ways that we don't always see, we're not always aware of, and yet God is doing things to make things happen for you and me. So we're going to spend some time looking at both Exodus 1 and a little bit into Exodus chapter 2. In the passage I just read, we discovered that the Israelites are living in Egypt. They've been there for generations, and most of the time they had been there, they were there under the blessing and protection of Pharaoh. They had been very well treated. But one Pharaoh died and another came to power. And over the years, the Israelites grew from just a little tribe to a very populous people. And so many of the Egyptians began to fear these foreigners living among us. I mean, what happens if they rise up against us? What happens if they decide to take the side of an invading army? We'd be in trouble. And so the new Pharaoh decided we need to treat them harshly. So he forced them into slavery. He made them be slaves, specifically working in two cities, Ramses and Pithom, building great structures for the Pharaoh. But as much as they were abused, as much as they were oppressed, they grew, they flourished. More and more and more Israelites, they grew as a nation of people right there in Egypt. Well, Pharaoh felt more and more threatened by it, so he puts an order out there to the Hebrew midwives, the women who would help the Israelite women have their children. It says, if when you are helping a woman deliver the baby, if you see it's a boy, kill it. Kill. They want to reduce the population, right? Kill the boys. Well, the Hebrew women wouldn't do that. They were faithful to God. And so they make up a lie to Pharaoh. They say Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, meaning Egyptian women are weak. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. Like, we can't help it. They're already born before we get there. So Pharaoh, more threatened, more desperate, more insecure, makes a law, an edict for all the land. Everybody knows it, not just the midwives. It says in Exodus 1:22, every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile. They'll drown or be eaten by crocodiles. But let every girl live. So it's into that context where the people are being oppressed, and particularly boys, Hebrew boys, are being threatened, that one very special boy is born. And so if we go to Exodus 2, beginning with verse 1, it says this. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman. These are Moses' parents. And she became pregnant and gave birth to a son, Moses. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it, put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go get one of the Hebrew women, meaning my mom? Shall I go get a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby for you? Yes, go, she answered. So the girl went and got Moses' mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. And when the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. So this is a miraculous story. Moses should have died. I mean, that was Pharaoh's order, but instead he's protected. He's saved by Pharaoh's own daughter. He ends up being nursed by his own mother, who makes some money on the deal. He ends up being raised in Pharaoh's own household as royalty, really as a prince of Egypt. Amazing story. But before we go too far with that, I want us to just linger for a moment on the order that Pharaoh made. I mean, it's easy to kind of just read these old stories, and I want to let that horror sink in. I don't know of anything more despicable than to threaten the lives of innocent babies. I mean, what kind of insecure king, what kind of wicked, evil ruler would say the best solution here is we'll just kill babies? I mean, what does it say about the character and the heart of Pharaoh? And by the way, he's not the only one. If you think about the New Testament, when Jesus was born, King Herod did the same thing. He ordered the infant boys in Bethlehem to be slaughtered. What a terrible thing. Hopefully that kind of thing doesn't happen in our world today, but still, terrible things are done in this world. Terrible things happen. And sometimes it's evil men and women who make them happen. And when terrible things happen, one of the things that you and I might wonder is, where is God? In the midst of tragedy, in the midst of heartache, in the midst of loss, in the midst of suffering, we might ask the question, where is God? And the interesting thing, if you go back and read Exodus 1 and 2, which I hope you will do, God is barely mentioned. You hear about this terrible suffering at the hands of Pharaoh. You hear this story about this boy that was born, but you don't hear any statement that God was at work. Where was God? Where was God when the Israelites were forced into slavery? Where was God when they were suffering? Where was God as infants were being slaughtered? Where is God when you go through a hard time, when I go through a hard time, when we see on the news that terrible things are happening? Where is God? And I need to just be honest, if you want to try to find the answer in Exodus 1 and 2, you're not going to find it. It's not there. There's no a reasonable, acceptable answer that says, oh, this explains what God was doing. It's not there. Unless you read the text with eyes of faith, which is what we're meant to do. I mean, just think about the story again. What were the Israelites even doing in Egypt? Well, if you read back in Genesis, many generations before, there had been a terrible famine, and God had arranged the events to lead the Israelites to be in Egypt so that they could eat. There was food there, so that they could survive. God intended that to happen. You might say, well, where was God when the people were suffering? Well, the people were thriving. The people were growing in number. Maybe God's hand was in that. Like, well, what happens when the Pharaoh says, kill the babies? Well, it says Exodus 1, 20-21. God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then we have the story of Moses, that it's clear that there is some guiding, protecting hand over this particular child, born in a home that should have led to his death, and yet taken into another home where he was treated like royalty. It isn't hard when you look through the eyes of faith to see how God was moving throughout the story with eyes behind. God was moving. God was working behind the scenes. God was moving in ways that maybe weren't obvious. Elie Wiesel, who was a survivor of Auschwitz during the Holocaust, World War II, says, I remember clinging. He's talking about when he was at Auschwitz. He says, I remember clinging to the thought that nothing is unknown to God. Well, nothing is truly known to man. What it means, I think, by that is that we wonder, God, what are you doing? Where are you? Why are you letting this happen? But faith tells us God knows everything that's happening, and that God is always at work. I can't help but think of the cross. I mean, the day that Jesus was dying on the cross, who possibly could have stood there? His mother, his followers, who could have stood there and not wondered, where is God right now? Why would God let this innocent man suffer and die like this? I mean, even Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? I mean, that's the question we ask. God, where are you? What were you doing? And yet we know that behind the scenes, God was doing something really important, saving the world, making salvation possible for you and for me. That's the way it is. Sometimes all we see is the tragedy, but God is working in ways we can't begin to believe or imagine. Following our own recent tragedy at Stoneman Douglas, I struggled. God, where were you that day? Why did you let this happen? And someone recommended to me a book that's about evil and suffering by an author named Tom Long. He writes this: God's power at work in the world does not look very potent, large, or worthy. God is at work in the world, but it doesn't look like it. From all appearances, God's action in the world is just too small, too insignificant to count, but it turns out to be powerfully effective. It doesn't look like power, but it is nevertheless working in stealth fashion to produce something of great size and pervasive impact. Writing about a persecution of Christians in Japan, Makoto Fujimori says that faith is to see beyond the darkness, meaning the darkness of the current moment, and to live toward that faint glimmer of hope on the horizon. I mean, it's easy for us to look back at Exodus 1 and 2 and other passages of Scripture and other events in our life, I think, and say, oh yeah, that's where God was. I mean, maybe you can do that. Think back to difficult times in your life, and now it's obvious. I see what God was doing. I see how God sent that person to help me. I see how God was comforting me and giving me strength. But let's be honest, when it was happening, it wasn't as obvious. That sometimes in the midst of the struggle, it's hard to remember that God is at work. It takes faith to trust that God is working behind the scenes, that we're not going to see the evidence of that faith until someday in the future. So you might think, well, this miraculous story about Moses' birth, being rescued, raised in Pharaoh's home, I mean, it can only go good, right? It can only go up from here. No. Moses one day discovers that he is not Egyptian, he's an Israelite. He becomes aware of Israelites' suffering because of the home he's raised in. And one day he's out, he sees that an Egyptian slave taskmaster is beating an Israelite. And Moses becomes enraged and he pounces upon the slave master and kills him. And he buries him in the sand, but then has to escape Egypt for fear that Pharaoh might find out. He's a murderer now. He's got to go, he's got to escape to save his life. So he goes off to a land called Midian. It's out in the desert. He leaves a life of royalty behind. He becomes a shepherd. He marries a Midianite woman, not an Egyptian woman, not a Jewish woman, a Midianite woman named Zipporah, and they have a son that they name Gershom. And the word Gershom means, I have become a foreigner in a foreign land. That's what he named his son. I've become a foreigner in a foreign land. Things aren't going great for Moses. Now, I just want you for a moment to try to put yourself in Moses' place. Maybe it won't be hard. Imagine being Moses, growing up as royalty, yet knowing that you're not really. You're not an Egyptian, you're an Israelite. Imagine growing up with the awareness that his adopted family was actually the one responsible for his true people's suffering. Imagine knowing that who you really are, an Israelite, doesn't make you part of that community. He was separate from it. He wasn't one of them. Imagine feeling the guilt and the fear and the shame of knowing you've done something terrible, feeling like you've got to run away. It's your only choice. Imagine being exiled, far from home, everything you know, everything that's comfortable, everything familiar. That you now live something you never imagined, a poor shepherd, hiding from a life that you once knew and loved, now a foreigner in a foreign land. Imagine how Moses must have felt. He knew the story of his birth, that he had been saved, and now he had to escape and live this life of obscurity. I wonder if he ever asked these questions from Psalm 77. Will the Lord reject forever? Will he never show his favor again? Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? Has he in anger withheld his compassion? I wonder if you've ever asked questions like that. I wonder if you're asking questions like that now. But here's the thing. You and I know the story. Even as Moses must have faced discouragement, you and I both know that God wasn't done with Moses. That God was still working behind the scenes in Moses' life. That God still had a purpose and a plan for Moses that was yet to be revealed. And in the same way, I bet God is working behind the scenes of your life. That God also has a purpose and a plan that He may not have yet revealed to you, and yet it's unfolding in ways that you can't even begin to imagine. It takes faith to trust that God is working when we can't see it. Philip Yancey says, faith means believing in advance what will only make sense in reverse. And so Exodus chapter 2 ends with these words. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning. He remembered His covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob. God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Notice the words I underlined. God heard their groaning, and He hears ours. He remembered His covenant just as He remembers His promises to each of us. God looked on the Israelites just as God watches over us. And He was concerned. He was moved to action. We don't know what that action is yet in the story, but it's coming. God was concerned just as He's concerned about the details of your life and mine. I don't know what you're going through, friends. I don't know what you're facing. I don't know what you've been through. I don't know what struggles you have, but I want to say to you today, even if you're not sure where God is working in your life behind the scenes. It takes faith to know it. Whatever you're struggling with, whatever you're going through, know that God hears your groans. Know that God remembers His promises. Know that God is looking over you, watching over you. He never takes His eye off of you. And know that His heart is moved to help you. God wasn't done with Moses. God wasn't done with the Israelites, and He's not done with you either. God's still at work. But most of the time behind the scenes. Let's pray.